And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Benched with Bubba, episode 105. I have a special guest on the show tonight. I had the pleasure of having a few drafts with him, football and beverage-wise, and baseball, a little bit of everything. He's a pitching guru, the mechanics of pitching, baseball in general. You can find his voice on Baseballholics Anonymous. You can find him on Twitter at Doug_Thorburn. Doug, how we doing, man?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing, Brian?
Good. It's fun to get to do this. I know we've been in talks a couple times about lining it up, so it's good to finally bang it out and talk a little pitching tonight, and maybe with a little fantasy twist to make everybody happy.
Absolutely. And when it comes to pitching, I'm always down to yammer about it. So bring it on.
Yep, I am all about it. And I want to start out before we get into actual players and everything. Let's talk the kind of mechanics of pitching. I know you've talked about it and everybody, I've mentioned it many times on my show. Listen to Baseballholics Anonymous. It's very simple. Just listen to it. It's got great stuff. And Doug always does a pitching breakdown. He picks a pitcher a week, or his co-host picks a pitcher a week, and he breaks him down and does his thing there. So this recent week he did Walker Buehler, and we'll talk about him later. But when you're looking at a pitcher, let's start with just like a young pitcher. When you're scouting talent, what are you looking for in like the proper mechanics where you think maybe this will limit injury and so on and so forth?
Well, for me, it's funny because you're going to get you ask 100 different people, you're going to get 100 different opinions about what specifics they like to see, and so many times it boils down to anecdotal evidence or what they did back in their playing days. And for me, it really boils down to the simplicity of being an athlete. In order to be an athlete, you have to be balanced. That's true in every single stinking sport. You're supposed to just keep the head over the body, stay balanced throughout, whether you're hitting, pitching, you're an NFL quarterback, you're martial arts, you're golfing, you're surfing, whatever it is, balance is always key. And so that's something I look for with pitchers, because so much of the coaching instruction now, it just kind of throws balance out the window, acts like it doesn't matter. For some reason, I don't know, in the name of angles or what have you. So for me, that's a big one. And then the second thing I look for is power. And what I mean by power is hip shoulder separation, or I call it torque, but it's that big twist that you'll see with a golfer as he winds up his swing, or a hitter as he winds up his swing, or a pitcher right before he fires that upper half. And so I look for that combination. And there tends to be sort of a push-pull, as guys ramp up the power, they tend to lose some of their balance, they lose some stability. So ideally, I like to see a guy who's maximizing both. He's getting as much power as possible while maintaining stability, which is why I loved Jose Fernandez so much. To me, Jose Fernandez was the future of pitching, because his power was unreal, such that being able to stabilize that was a feat of its own. And he had excellent balance, incredible stability. So for me, it's really just power and balance, and then having strong timing, being able to line everything up and do it, or being able to repeat the positioning and the timing of the delivery. So those are the main things for me, and everything else is really just a branch off of that.
It's funny you mentioned twist, because I wrote down the word twist as you were talking about the balance part. So, and then you just mentioned kind of how it's a happy medium. If they ramp up to go harder, then they lose some of the balance. Do you see it where like a guy maybe twists a little more, then he maybe falls off to a side? Or when you're talking balance, are you talking about on the finish of the pitch or throughout like the middle of the delivery type situation?
I'm talking the whole thing. And
Okay.
really, I look at it in two different ways, because at release point, I call it posture, but it's really still balance. It's just that release point is kind of an animal all its own. Uh, Everything leading up to foot strikes, when that front foot, that lift leg comes back into contact with the ground, everything into that it's tough to maintain balance while having strong momentum. But ideally, that to me, that's the power component. And so I like to see that blend where someone's maximizing the power and momentum, but also remaining stable. But then after foot strike, you have a lot of guys who tend to invoke spine tilt. So they'll tilt their head to the glove side. And so you'll see this position where their spine almost looks like it's curved like a C. And they'll do it trying to get a higher release point. And so many guys do it. And for some of them, it's a functional strength issue. They just don't have the strength and conditioning necessary to withstand the rigors of pitching at the highest possible speeds. So that's the highest speed part of the motion, because your arm's accelerating. But you have other guys who do it blatantly because they're trying to manipulate a higher arm slot. And so for me, I'm always really honing in on that time period after foot strike, but into release point to see if a guy is, first off, to see if he's tilting, then to try to understand whether that tilt is because he's intentionally manipulating his release point or if it's a lack of stability and a lack of functional strength, because that second one is something that can take longer to fix. Whereas the mechanical thing, it can be quick, but the player has to want to do it, and they don't always want to.
Yeah, no, that's the crazy thing is you get your rhythm and what's comfortable for you and what is comfortable for you and what is, what's you should be doing are probably two different things half the time. So it's definitely, especially the younger players, and that's why I wanted to ask you those guys, because we're seeing a lot of these younger kids just throwing just harder and harder and harder, and you think it's more the torque, maybe some other factors that I don't know, but you focus on way more. And a lot of people understand kind of the basics of what we're talking about. I just wanted to ask you so you can kind of dig in a little deeper and explain it to people. But when you're seeing all these kids now, it seems like more so kids than veterans getting these arm injuries. What factor of the mechanics is the issue more so, and can it be changed with these guys?
Well, number one, I think the velocity obsessed culture that we are currently in is driving some of the injuries, because when you increase velocity, you're necessarily increasing the kinetic toll on the throwing arm. So the big thing is how much the arm has to go into maximum external rotation. So what that is the arm cocking phase, where the forearms laying back, or like cocked up right before it actually accelerates forward into release point. And what we've noticed is that these guys who throw crazy hard, they tend to have a ton of external rotation, and that puts a lot of stress on the UCL. And that's just a natural part of throwing hard. That's part of why they throw hard, is that they can get that extra bit of external rotation, but that is putting additional strain. So that is certainly an issue. And then part of the injuries we're seeing now also, it drives me so nuts. And you've obviously listened to Baseballholics a lot, so it's something I talk about quite a bit. But I can't stand how players are put in these arbitrary buckets of, oh, you're 100 pitches, you're a starter. Oh, you're 20 pitches, you're a reliever. I'm sorry, they're humans. Some of these guys, their optimal workload will be 60 pitches, and maybe it's every 3 days. Maybe it'll be 85 pitches. Maybe it'll be 40 pitches. And being cognizant of that, and to me, that's a pitching coach's job, is to know your player well enough to know about what his normal workload should look like, but also to know when maybe he's off a bit, or maybe he's just gassed this day. Maybe he's really hungover. Who knows? Especially when you're dealing with relievers. Like, there are so many different factors that go into it. And same thing with injuries. You hear all these supposed experts of pitching who claim that they can see one thing guys doing wrong, and that's going to cause the injury. Well, I'm sorry. Injuries have a multitude of causes. You've got, like I said, the velocity ends up playing a role. Mechanics end up playing a role. Genetics end up playing a role. Workloads play a role. Like, there are so many different factors. My favorite example of this is Jake Peavy, because we did an analysis of Jake Peavy back in the day, like, I don't know, 06, 05, something like that, for the National Pitching Association. We did a high-speed motion capture, and he had a big injury precursor that we noticed, where we call it elbow drag, where the elbow lags behind the shoulder line. And we warned the Padres about this. And there wasn't much the Padres could do. This is the way he threw, but we just let them know this is a potential risk. Well, PV never blew out with the Padres, but he did blow out with the White Sox. And when he did, it wasn't the UCL that popped. It was earlier in the kinetic chain. It was actually his lat. And that's become a big thing lately, actually. We're seeing this rash of lat injuries. But when PV's happened, it was vicious. I don't know if you saw it, but you could see the thing detach and the ripple go up his back. It was terrible. But it was the kind of thing where he had such amazing structural integrity of his elbow that there's absolutely no way we could have known that his structural integrity was that good. But that's why his UCL never popped. Instead, it was a lat muscle that popped beforehand, because he was putting so much strain on it, and he had that unreal structural integrity. But again, there is no test for that. There's no way to say, oh, well, this player has an abnormally strong ligament. We can go ahead and throw caution to the wind a little bit with him. But that's the thing with injuries. It's never a simple explanation, or rarely, I should say. I never said it never, right? So rarely a
Yeah.
simple explanation. But everyone, as soon as someone gets hurt, you get all these guys coming out of the woodwork saying, haha, I told you so, I knew it, as if they were rooting for the guy to get hurt. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's horrible. Like, and it's so true because there always are the guys. I told you he's getting hurt. Like, we'll talk about Shohei Ohtani later. Everyone's like, I told you he should have had the surgery. Like that was obvious, guys. But like everybody, like we've seen studies where it's not obvious, idiots. But you mentioned the lat injuries, and that's crazy because those have come, in the forefront almost worse than Tommy John this year. And I never even paid attention to the fact that it was basically due to the same type of motions, but that takes it over. You mentioned the pitch counts, and I laugh at that all the time. Like when we grew up watching baseball where Nolan Ryan would go out and throw like 140 pitches. He'd pop some aspirin and he'd go pitch 4 days later. Then all these other guys are just workhorses. It was never an issue. Back in the old days, I know they didn't throw as hard. They pitch every 3 days, 4-man rotations or whatever. It was never a problem. But now it's like the staple unless you have a special case, obviously. And Trevor Bauer's one of them, Mad Bum and some others. I was actually watching the Dodgers recently with Kenta Maeda. They didn't do it as much as a pitch count. It was he's facing 21 batters. And that was a little different to me because then they weren't as focused on the pitch count as they were just the workload in general. Still kind of the same idea, but a different approach, which I can almost respect a little more. What do you think is the actual logic behind this, or will it ever change basically? Because it just doesn't make sense. You kind of said it already. All of a sudden we're in this culture where they have to regulate for some reason.
Yeah, I think it's, and this is just me shooting from the hip and trying to guess why the culture is the way it is, but baseball is so traditional, and so it's so hard for teams to go outside the box of convention. And so I think teams just have a hard time putting individual rules for guys. So like you mentioned Nolan Ryan. Now you say if you start talking about injuries and how guys are hurt more nowadays, and they might go ahead and say, well, guys are throwing now harder nowadays. Well, not
Nolan Ryan was the Ryan Express, folks.
Nolan was a freak.
Yep.
Randy Johnson pitched forever, and he threw crazy hard. And okay, I guess he was a freak too. I mean, Livan Hernandez, no, he didn't throw that crazy hard, but he was known to be a workhorse. He could absolutely throw 140 pitches and not have anybody worry. And the problem I have now is that it used to be that we could identify those guys who could go longer, and nowadays we really can't. Even someone like Bauer, he's never pitched 180 innings in a season, so I'm not ready to label him a workhorse yet. He's on pace this year to exceed that for the first time in his career, and we'll see if that happens. But it's just such a different expectation. And yeah, there are certain guys that can handle that workload, and there are certain guys that can't. And there are also different ways to look at workload beyond just raw pitch count. I mean, earlier this season, Jacob deGrom had a game where he threw like 45 pitches in the first inning, and then he was done. And a lot of people were up in arms about it and frustrated about it. I was applauding because I wish we could see that a lot more often. I'm sorry, a 45 pitch inning, it's kind of like, let's say someone said, okay, you can run the mile, or you can break up a mile into 7 roughly equal parts and have nice little 10-minute breathers in between. What do you think is going to be easier?
Exactly.
Where do you think you're going to be able to do better? So the expectation that someone's going to be able to pitch professionally for 45 pitches, basically be on the mound for 30, 40 minutes straight of pumping gas, and think that's going to be the same as if he had spread that workload across 3 innings and an hour of work, you've got to be kidding me.
And that's the thing is, like you said, and that's what I wish more people would look at. That's kind of where I liked the Maeda approach a little better. It's more like, okay, this is the workload. This is what they did. When a guy goes out there and throws, 7 9 to 12 pitch innings, or he goes and throws 3 35 pitch innings in a row, let's realistically think, okay, he still can't go 5 innings. Let's be real, but he might be able to go the distance in the other game. Like, there's two completely different factors, like you're saying, that people just don't wrap their heads around completely.
Yeah, and it's the whole understanding of workloads and its relationship to injury. And I think people are getting too focused on the workload itself. And it's funny how how the general accepted workload or pitch count has hovered right around the 100 pitch mark. It's so bizarre to me because obviously players are very different, but also why would it be 100 pitches? What's so special about 100 pitches? Because it's triple digits? Because we have a number system that happens to have nice round numbers near 100? Like, that's silly to me. I've of all the staffs I've coached, I've never had a team where everyone had the same workload or the same expectation. I have had teams where everyone was expected to pitch, just to take some of the stigma off of it, to let teams know that that's part of the expectation. It also makes practices run really efficiently because you can do circuits with bullpens. But anyways, I see the way teams are used now, and it's almost as if, well, everyone knows you can't let a guy throw 120 pitches, and everyone knows that you have to structure your bullpen this way, or have guys in certain defined roles or whatever it is. And I don't know. Anytime that sentence starts with "everyone knows," I just immediately start doubting it.
Yeah, and I could sit here and talk to you about this all night. We talked about it for a while last time we were at the draft, and you mentioned, you've coached staffs and it was more of a workload deal and everything. Explain to me this, if you have an answer on it, which you will. College kids, they'll go 140, 150 pitches on a Friday night, and I know they pitch one start a week. That's the argument they have. But try to explain to me how that workload's different than what we're talking about with MLB players.
It's not.
Exactly. That's all I just wanted to say. Because I see that. I see that stuff. That's what I just wanted to hear. Like, unless I was completely missing something, because I see that stuff when you're watching the College World Series or the semis and all that stuff, and you watch these kids just throw pitch after pitch after pitch, and you're thinking, this is supposed to be the top prospect coming out. I don't even know if I want to touch that arm right now. Like, that's terrifying to me from what we've seen in history. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but that just seems like a more of a red flag than some of the other situations we're talking about. It's pretty interesting to me.
Absolutely. And the coach has incentive because of his legacy, and the team wants to win and sell tickets. And it's a huge business, a huge industry for those colleges. So they have reason to push these players who are going to be gone. They're only at university for 3 or 4 years anyways. So before, especially the good players, they're going to get drafted as juniors. So they're only going to be on the baseball team for 3 years. They don't have a lot of incentive to protect these guys. They're trying to get as much out of them as possible. Now, no college would say, oh, yeah, we don't care about injury. Hell no. Of course they're going to say all the right things and that they're trying to protect arms. But how many times I have seen a player's development sacrificed in the name of winning some college game or winning some championship, or worse off, winning a high school game. I mean, there was a situation just about a month ago where this is a high school player that I work with, and their coach wanted him to do something he'd never done before. Basically wanted him to increase his workload at the very end of his longest season. And he's a senior, so he was potentially going to get drafted. He already had a commitment somewhere. Like, he had all sorts of other people who had vested interest in his future, and yet his high school coach was willing to throw caution to the wind just to, maybe advance to the sectional finals. And that was so silly to me, because this is, when it comes to high school, when it comes to college, when it comes to the minors, basically everything except MLB, I look at as a developmental league.
Yes.
Wins and losses don't matter as long as the pitcher gets better.
I'm 100% on board with that, and that's why I get flustered. Like, what are you guys doing right now? Last thing we'll talk about here, and then we'll move on to some players. We've seen a lot of guys go to more off-speed pitches, curveballs, sliders, whatever, and kind of gone away from the fastball, at least the ones that have shown a lot of success this year. And people are praising it, and I get both sides of the story. Is there a concern from a mechanical standpoint, from a possible injury standpoint, to these guys throwing these more off-speed pitches, the torque on the elbows and all that stuff? Or is that just, if they're being controlled properly, the amount that they're increasing their workload of that pitch is going to affect them at all?
It really depends on the way that they throw it. So, for example, breaking balls, that's the big one, because we see it sometimes with off-speed. I'm not as worried about changeups. And the rationale behind that, I don't want this to take too long, so I'll just give you the nuts and bolts.
Take as long as you want.
But basically, when it comes to the breaking balls, you've got twister breaking balls, especially curveballs, and I call them twister because it involves a twist of the wrist near release point, where the thumb goes from the bottom of the baseball and rotates to the top. When I was a kid, a coach told me it was like throwing a Pringles can end over end. I had other coaches say, pulling down the shade and all that kind of
I've heard
stuff.
that one.
Turn the doorknob or whatever it is. And I mean, you can put your thumb on your UCL and actually try rotating, and you can feel that pain. And so that is a potential injury precursor. And so that is definitely something I don't want a guy throwing too often. I also don't like them functionally because a twister curve leaves the hand differently than a fastball. It leaves it on a different plane. It has a hump in it. It pops up out of the hand. And a good hitter can see that. It's essentially a tell. They know it's coming. They don't have to identify the pitch or find the eye of the curveball because they can tell out of hand. And it's the kind of thing that looks amazing in high school and it'll get low A hitters out. But by the time they hit the advanced minors, that kind of thing, it tends to get ripped. So when it comes to a guy who's pumping up his breaking ball usage, if he's throwing a twister curve, I don't like that at all. Now, if he's throwing a supinated curve, which is kind of like throwing a football spiral, or some people call it a karate chop curveball where the palm is facing inward, that is a biomechanically efficient. That's the way your arm is designed to throw. And we've done tests with the motor sleeve to find out what the stresses are on the UCL. And it's actually less stressful to throw a supinated curveball than it is a fastball because of the way you're holding the baseball. The full mass of the baseball is not actually being pushed forward by your hand. It's not being propelled by the elbow. And so it ends up having lower readings for the stress on the UCL. So again, it really depends on how the guy's throwing it. If he's throwing a football curve, then I'm cool with it. You want to increase the results like Lance McCullers. You can throw as many as he wants. I don't really have a problem with it. But when you talk about the guys who have that twister curve that pops up out of the hand, yeah, I don't want him throwing more of that pitch, not at all.
Okay, that's what I was wondering because Lance is one of the guys that always comes to mind. He throws like the World Series last year. It was 90% curveballs. It felt like at times.
Yeah, you threw 25 straight. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, I'm sitting there just in awe going because I didn't know that part you mentioned about the good kind and the bad kind. I'm just in my head. I'm thinking, okay, I remember back in the day, curveballs, elbows, yes. And I'm just watching that going, oh no, this kid is so good. I know you guys love him on the show. I love Lance McCullers. I'm like, I know the World Series is a big deal, but don't make this be the end. Just don't do it now. But yeah, so that's really interesting stuff. And Doug, we might have to come on and do it all over again. But that was awesome stuff there. Let's do some player topics. You've mentioned a couple guys you took some deeper dives in, so we want to talk about them, and then we can kind of quick hit on some others. But Mad Bum is back for the Giants. He made a couple starts, and as a Giants fan, I was sitting there kind of skeptical watching, but I'm cautious because it's Mad Bum. Took a lot of time off, couldn't throw with his pinky messed up. Last two starts have looked a lot better. He's already into the third tonight in Colorado, looking okay. What did you see kind of digging in on Madison?
Well, with Bumgarner, there's a few things I look for. And full disclosure, I'm a big fan of what he brings to the table. I love his delivery. I love his ability to consistently repeat his delivery. If you go on Brooks Baseball, which is one of my favorite resources, they have game logs. And on the game logs, they'll show you the release point. And so it's just a cluster of dots. But it can tell you a lot about a guy. The tighter the cluster, the more repetition he has, the better he can repeat his release point. And Bumgarner has one of the tightest clusters I've ever seen. He does it game in and game out. Now, that cluster wasn't quite as tight as I'd like to see it for a few games, but it wasn't really a concern in the same sense that, like, his velocity was down slightly, but it was down like 0.2, 0.3 miles an hour than his average from last year. So, again, not really concerned. Now, last year, maybe not the best example because he had like 5 consecutive seasons of increasing strikeout rates. He's someone who has increases velocity throughout seasons. Even that one year where he threw like 260 innings or whatever the hell it was, I think it was 2014 or something like that. He still continued to throw harder and harder even into October. It's really interesting. And so that's one of the things I look for from him is just that the mechanics are honed. In fact, I had the chance, I live in the Bay Area, and he had his final rehab start was with the San Jose Giants, a Class A affiliate. And so I had a chance to go check him out on his rehab start. And sure enough, his mechanics were pretty much honed. I mean, his timing wasn't perfect. Like I said, that cluster was a little bit bigger than he usually has, but it's still better than 95% of the pitchers out there. That velocity, yeah, is down a little bit. It's been down the last couple of years, but again, we're talking less than a full mile an hour over the last 3 years. It's not really a major concern. And he's never been a high velocity guy. He's always been 91, 92, is about where he sits. You know what I mean? So there was stuff wise, I thought he was fine. What I found to be really interesting about him is the his ability to miss bats and how the pitches have changed, because it used to be something where he could miss bats with everything. He's basically a fastball, cutter, curveball guy. And all three pitches were missing bats more than 10% of the time, like back in 2016. But then in 17, it really fell off. And he basically has only been missing bats with his curveball. And this season, at least so far, it's been more about his cutter, I think. But he is starting to miss some bats with all three pitches now, which is good to see. And with him, he has to be pretty much honed with his location. And for Bumgarner, that means staying on the lower shelf of the strike zone, that lower third. And he was elevating a little bit in those first few starts. He also elevated in the rehab start I saw, but he got away with it because he was against A-ball hitters, something that he can't get away with against major league hitters. But now he's consistently staying down in the zone more. So I think his mechanics, his stuff, his repertoire, everything's pretty much back to what we're used to seeing from Bumgarner. So I'm encouraged and I'm looking forward to good things. I just hope he can reverse the negative trend on that whiff percentage that he's had the last couple of years. But in those last two games, he's been able to get some swings and misses. So good things.
Yeah, he's been back up to about a K per inning, and the swinging strikes are much, much better because those first couple starts, it had me a little concerned. But it's like you said, he's never really – people always think of Bumgarner and they think he's an overpowering pitcher. He's really never been an overpowering guy. He's just a workhorse that locates, like you said, and gets swing and misses with his stuff when he's on. One thing with his what was that?
I was just going to throw in because you were talking about the breaking balls and like guys who throw too many. He's actually one of my favorite examples of that, because this was probably 4 years ago or something. He was throwing something like 35-40% of his top secondary, which was being called a slider. And so everyone was yelling, "Oh no, this guy's going to break, he's going to get hurt." That's the rule, right? The 30% rule. Guy throws more than 30% sliders, that's a no-no, and he's going to bust his elbow. And then Brooks Baseball reclassified the pitch from a slider to a cutter. Nothing changed about the actual pitch. They just went back and reclassified it, and they called everything he'd ever thrown a cutter now instead of a slider. And for whatever reason, and all of a sudden, crickets. No one said a damn thing. And
magically, it's like, his elbow's fine.
Yeah, it's the same damn pitch. It's the exact same thing. He's throwing it the same way. The difference between a slider and a cutter is like 5 degrees of supination. It's such a small thing if done correctly, which he throws it the spiral style. So, like a spiral of football. So I'm fine with the way that he throws it. I just always found it so funny, and to me, that's what's wrong with just looking at the numbers or following those blind rules without accounting for the context of a player, because you end up with a Bumgarner situation where all of a sudden he's fine because he's doing something differently. No, he's actually doing the exact same thing he's always done. They just reclassified it,
Shocker. Side note, you mentioned, the slider to the cutter, and people classified it differently. Joey Lucchesi is a guy that's got the slurve going on. People can't really decide if it's a slider or a curveball. It's called the slurve. How does – I'm imagining it's the same problem, but I'll ask the dumb question now. How does that compare to on his elbow compared to just a curveball or just a slider?
It's purely semantics. Slurve, back in the day, it used to mean slow curve to certain people, to certain scouts. And now it's more slider curve. I tell you, back in the day, we would – because we worked with a lot of pro guys, and they're just trying to get the attention of teams and scouts. And so we just tell them whatever was popular at the time. So if scouts were looking for curveballs, if that was a popular pitch, and the guy threw something that was looked more like a slider, thrown a little harder, thrown with a little more of a tilty break to it, we just say, "Oh, it's a power curve," and there, now you have a curveball and you get written up better. And then a few years later, they didn't want curves anymore. Everyone wanted a slider. And so what do? We just put the word power in front again and say, okay, if you call it a curve, don't. Call it a power slider, and they'll make their own interpretation of it, and they'll write you up that way, and you'll be looked at more favorably because that's what they want to see right now. It's, to me, the whole differentiation between curveball, slider, cutter, all that kind of stuff. It depends on the player. If the player throws 3 different breaking balls, then yeah, the hardest one with the least break is a cutter. The slowest one with the most break is a curve. The one in between is a slider. Cool. I'm fine with that. But beyond that, unless they throw 3 of them, call it whatever the hell you want. What was it? Major League 2, where they call it the Exterminator and the Terminator.
Yeah. Yeah. You hit it, you can name it. He makes 5 new pitches in the offseason. Yeah. I call this the Eliminator. I call this the Masturbator. Yeah. Oh, God. Go on that tangent for a while. Good old Major League 1 and 2. Let's talk about an Indian. Good segue here. Trevor Bauer, you could easily see him playing Wild Thing in Major League, but he's not because he's in real life. What did you find out with Trevor Bauer? Because when I was referring to workhorse earlier, he's going deep into games, throwing 120-plus pitches a lot. And you're not seeing it with many guys this year. Now, you mentioned 176 innings pitched. He's only gone over that once, so maybe he won't do that again. But what do you see with a guy like Trevor Bauer? He's already had 113 innings pitched this season.
He does have a heavy workload. I do trust the Indians when it comes to that because there are a few organizations that really know their players well, and they know how to extract the most out of them. And the Indians are one of those teams. The Astros are one of those teams where I trust what they're doing with their staff. Like with McCullers, it threw me off to see 25 straight breaking balls, but it's like, you know what? The Astros know what they're doing. They develop their pitchers extraordinarily well. And I know that McCullers throws it in a non-dangerous way, so I'm going to be okay with it. With Bauer and with Cleveland, I'm okay with it so far, and especially when you look at the fact that his velocity is actually up from where it has been. It's basically continued to increase throughout, so he's definitely not showing any signs of fatigue, at least yet. What I think is really fascinating about Bauer, and he's been a very interesting yet frustrating player to evaluate the last several years because every season he shows up with a totally different delivery. He's remade it. His stuff changes every year. It's very hard to keep track of what Bauer is. But I will say the changes that he's made for this year, it's the best I've ever seen him by far, and it's not even close. I'll start with his slider. So his slider was a pitch that just got ripped a couple of years ago, and it got ripped so hard that he just ditched it. He stopped throwing the slider. He threw just a handful of them in 2017. Was basically done with it. Well, then he revamped it, remade it. He actually does this thing where he puts thumbtacks in the baseball so he can see the spin while he's throwing it. This is before the Rapsodo stuff. He's been doing this for a while, and his goal was to get pitches that complement each other. Well, he found a spin axis on the slider that masks well with one of his other 27 pitches that he throws. And that has gone to become by far his best pitch. It is his best strikeout pitch. No one's able to touch that thing. It's gone from being his biggest weakness to his biggest strength. And on top of that, like I said, his delivery changes every single season, but it's the best I've ever seen it. He always loses some balance during the stride phase. He's like the poster boy for a drive line, and that's a drive line thing is all their guys rear back and lean the head back towards second base during the stride. So that's just something he does, and not surprising. But post foot strike, from foot strike into release point, he is the most stable I have ever seen him. You rarely see guys whose balance is better the second half of the delivery than the first half. You almost never see it. But that's the case with Bauer. And I use the word vector every now and then to describe a guy's momentum. Like, to what extent is he putting all of his kinetic energy on a straight line toward the target? And Bauer hasn't always been the most efficient guy. In fact, back in the day, he used to switch sides of the rubber based off the identity of the hitter. And so his efficiency was all over the place. But I see him now, and it's crazy efficient. His vector is right on line. And you can tell because after he releases the baseball, there's no wasted energy. He doesn't fall off to the side. He's not – you see it all the time where a pitcher's body will go to the glove side and the ball goes to the arm side. talk about an inefficient vector. Well, with him, his body goes straight towards the target, and he slows down really easily, really efficiently. But to me, it's the stability angle and how everything flows toward the target. So the combination of his new slider, that's his best pitch all of a sudden, and him having the best delivery that I've seen from him, it's incredibly efficient. It makes a lot of sense why he's doing what he's doing, and it makes me even more okay with the fact that his workload is a bit up because he's more stable than he's ever been. So I think he's a little bit better to withstand it. That said, injuries take on many forms and there's so many pieces of the injury equation that I can't possibly predict whether something will befall him at some point. But I fall back on I trust the Indians.
Is he a top 10, top 15, top 20 pitcher for you rest of the season if he stays healthy?
Whew, that's a good question. Let's put him between top 15 and 18. And I say that totally arbitrarily. I don't have a list in front of me, like as if there's certain guys that he fits between. I actually think he's pretty similar to McCullers, and I love McCullers.
Yeah.
And I've been frustrated with Bauer for years. So that really says something. It's at least for me, I feel something. It's like, this is the guy that I've been so frustrated with for so long, and he's finally putting it together. Whereas McCullers I've liked since the day he was drafted. And I would consider them pretty close to each other right now.
I can dig that. Let's talk Walker Buehler, stud young pitcher for the Dodgers, rehabbing at Rancho Cucamonga these days. Should be back real soon. You found out some really interesting things when it comes to Walker Buehler. What are you liking with this kid, and what do you think the ceiling is for a guy like Walker Buehler?
Yeah, I can't believe what I discovered on Buehler. So Buehler was my assignment for the Baseballholics Anonymous podcast. He was my extract. And I didn't know that much about him going in. And I came out of the analysis just being blown away by this guy. It was funny is my opinion hadn't really formed properly going into it because he had Tommy John surgery about 2 months after he was drafted. He was drafted out of Vanderbilt. So I didn't really – he had a year and a half of basically being out of my consciousness. And then I didn't really watch much of his minor league action. He had 106 innings in the minors. So I just didn't know that much about him. But as I looked into it, I just became so stinking impressed with this guy. For me, you can see the stats. They speak for themselves. He's a strikeout machine. And his walk rate this year is the best of his career so far, his professional career. He's walking like 2.1 batters per 9, so that's excellent. But for me, what really impressed me about this guy is his stuff and specifically how he mixes and matches. So he throws crazy hard. He averages like almost 97 miles an hour on his fastball. But he's one of those guys who has all three breaking balls. He has a cutter, he has a slider, he has a curve. The cutter goes like 90, 91. The slider is high 80s, like 87 or something like that. And the curve is, I think it's 81 miles an hour. And each one has progressively different break as far as the curve is more vertical, the cutter is more horizontal, and the slider is more your traditional two-plane whatever. But I love how he uses them. He uses each one at about 11% clip, and he uses them equally no matter the count. He's just as likely to throw you a slider first pitch as he is the last pitch or with 2 strikes. He doesn't show any of those tendencies. You hear all the time about guys who are first pitch fastball, and especially from a rookie who's just trying to like show off how hard he throws. And he doesn't do that at all. If anything, actually the only thing that's really different as far as the different situations and counts he's in is on first pitch, he likes to mix in 2 seamers more often. So if he is throwing a fastball, it's probably going to have a little wrinkle in it. It's amazing. And then he also has a changeup on top of that. So this is a guy who has a legitimate 5-pitch repertoire, probably 6 if you differentiate the fastballs. And he's mixing and matching them in every single count against lefties, against righties. He doesn't have tendencies. He doesn't have blatant tendencies. In fact, I think his cutter, which has just this insane movement on it, he uses it most often when he's behind in the count. It should be a strikeout pitch,
Wow.
and it's not. His fastball is a strikeout pitch. He doesn't even, in fact, he throws fewer fastballs on first pitch than he does overall, his overall percentage. Most guys' first pitch fastball is higher than everything else. So here he is as a rookie, and Walker Buehler is already utilizing his repertoire on a very advanced level, and one that works really well for him. And some scouts might say, "Hey, he pitches backwards," but the connotation with that is typically a soft tosser, a junk baller who kind of has to pitch backwards. Bueller throws 97. He doesn't have to pitch backwards. He just does. It's really impressive. And then mechanically, he has some of the biggest torque I've ever seen. It's not a Roldis Chapman torque or hip shoulder separation. He has like I do a mechanics report card with a 2080 scouting scale, and Aroldis gets a 90 for torque. He breaks a scale. It doesn't even make sense. But Bueller, and I very 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 rarely do this, and especially because I had to increase my threshold in hip shoulder separation because gradually over the last 15 years that I've been doing this, leagues have caught on, and now more and more guys have huge hip shoulder separation, which is part of why they're throwing so much harder. And I actually did a personal audit of my report card, and that's what I found was that I was grading hip shoulder separation too high, so I had to recalibrate it and adjust for the times. Kind of like how a 93-mile-an-hour fastball meant something 15 years ago, and nowadays it's that's it. It was the same thing
So
with torque,
true.
and with Walker Bueller, he legitimately adjusted for the modern times has 80 torque. It is crazy. You take a freeze frame of him right before he fires trunk rotation, and it looks like his lower half is independent from his upper half. They look disconnected. It's crazy. I don't understand how he even physically does it. He's a physical freak to be able to get that kind of hip shoulder separation. His belt buckle is basically facing the plate, and the upper body has twisted back beyond going past his arm going past second base. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Just out of curiosity on your torque scale, what did a Hideo Nomo get?
Good question. I hadn't built the
Yeah,
mechanics
okay.
report card yet when I did that, but now I'm going to look.
Because that might break it even more.
I smell a homework assignment.
There you go. You can save it for your episode 98.
There you go.
Um, let's take a couple quick hitters on some other guys here. I want to mention Shohei Ohtani coming back from the DL later this week, most likely to hit for the rest of the year. As we know, his elbow's got issues. What's your kind of thoughts on this as a guy that understands structural damage to elbows? And we already mentioned, you got Tanaka and some other guys that they pitch through this, David Price. But the kind of thing you see with guys that pitch through it, they're older. Tanaka or Otani's so young still that you'd see more guys maybe elect to have the surgery. But every time you cut open a body and have surgery somewhere, it's not a good result, regardless of how the actual surgery works out. So, what would you how do you look at him not having a surgery and then just hitting until he can pitch again maybe next season?
Well, if he was just a pitcher,
Yeah.
as it is, I kind of understand why the pitchers want to try to put off surgery and going under the knife as much as possible because that's their livelihoods. Imagine that's the only thing or the main thing that has made their career, made their livelihoods has been their throwing arm. And all of a sudden someone's cutting into it and you don't know if you're going to ever come back the same. And you know that even if you are going to come back the same, it's going to require working harder than you've ever worked in your entire life just to pick up a baseball again in 10 months or a year. And so I get that. With the Angels, they have such a unique situation with Ohtani, not just because he's young and he does still have, 5-6 years of team control, but because he can hit. And to be honest, I don't know enough about the platelet-rich plasma injection that he had and how that might help to shield him from exacerbating the injury while hitting, because that's my worry. I mean, obviously he's going to DH the whole time and he's not going to throw, and it is a different motion, but I mean, look at the severity. I don't even know the severity of the tear. I assume it's more than a grade 1. Because Tanaka has had a grade 1 forever, and Ohtani himself was diagnosed with a grade 1 back when he was brought to the States. And so if it's now worse, I assume it's at least a grade 2. And that just means that it's a longer rip or a bigger tear. And I don't know enough about how hitting will make that worse. How many hitters elect to put off Tommy John and continue to hit all season? Nobody really does that. And so
that's why it's weird, because like Gleyber Torres had Tommy John last year and took the time off to rehab and come back for this season. So that's why I'm confused on what he's doing. I get it if he can stay healthy. Like, I get everything you're saying. I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just wondering at his age what he's waiting for.
Agreed. It's an interesting twist, and it's something that the Angels get to do because of Otani's ability with the bat. And I think it's good for baseball. I certainly want to see him back on the field.
Definitely.
But and actually, this is kind of an unusual take, but for a guy like Ohtani, who does have the ability with the bat and the arm, but obviously the arm was way more advanced. And the thing is that if you can throw, you can throw. Yep. But being able to hit means you have to adapt to facing the best pitchers on the planet. And his hitting was already behind. So this might be the best thing possible for his hitting development, that he's now going to be forced to focus solely on hitting for a while in order to make him a true two-way player a couple years down the road. That said, I don't know enough about his specific situation with how bad the strain is on his UCL and how much it could potentially be exacerbated by hitting to know whether or not it's actually worth it. I do find it fascinating, and oh man, I think that the Angels are in a bit of a tough place, but at the very least, it's not costing them much, and they do have a long-term investment in him, so it's not like they're making short-sighted decisions just to try to win now. They're considering all of this. So I have to assume they know more than I do, and they wouldn't be subjecting him to injuring his throwing arm worse than it is now, knowingly. So hopefully that's the case, and he'll be all right. But I tend to be pessimistic about the PRPs, and part of me just says, hey, get the surgery, be done with it. But since they're doing the PRPs and they do want him to come back as a hitter for now, that means if he does undergo Tommy John, we're not seeing him until 2020, because he's not going to undergo it until a few months from now.
Exactly. And that's the part that gets me. It's like, if you're going to have it, which he still might not, like you said, I don't know a ton about PRPs and everything either. But if he's going to have it, we're just going to lose him even longer. They're going to lose him even longer. Trout's window's getting shorter. When they lost him, they were still kind of in the race. That's falling apart quickly. It's just a lot of interesting dynamics. One thing I've always thought about him is, maybe it's going to be a lingering issue. How about he comes back when he can actually throw again, and he's a closer, hits during the game, closes. It's, we don't see it every day, obviously, but it's another angle that with his talent level, it's an option that they have.
Imagine bringing him into pinch hit, and then he stays into pitch.
Yeah, exactly. That could be it just absolutely wild having something like that. So
that'd be awesome.
We'll have to see how that goes. Let's talk Luis Castillo of the Cincinnati Reds, the guy that's let so many of us down that were so high on him going into the season. And it's like, of late, he's been pitching better. I watch him. He reminds me of Justin Marza, where he's just in one inning too long. It even happened again tonight on Monday night. He only left one earned run through 6 2/3, but he had 6 shutout going, and it's just like they kind of keep blemishing something that might build up his confidence. Just real quickly, are you seeing anything when you look at him that really concerns you, or is this just more of a young kid that's got just a couple little issues that can be worked out?
I think it's more of a case of last year he was peaking a bit, and this year he's something short of that peak. And what I mean by that is, you look at, for example, his velocity, and I think he led the majors in average velocity last year for starters. It was like 97.9 miles an hour or something. And this year it's like 96.2. He's dropped a tick and a half, which matters when everyone else is throwing crazy hard and all of a sudden you're not the hardest thrower anymore. He's a 3-pitch guy, but he's really diminished that third pitch being the slider. He's basically a fastball changeup guy these days. And the fastball's lost some velocity, but also so has the changeup. So everything's down a tick and a half. So hitters have a little bit of extra time. On top of that, Castillo, his command was an issue, a little bit of an issue before. It's a little bit more of an issue now. And he's a pitcher where, although he's actually a lot like Buehler in the case of, I really like his torque, his shoulder separation. So when I see that, when I see a guy who throws crazy hard, who has immense torque, it tells me that he's doing the right things mechanically to extract velocity. When I see a guy who throws crazy hard and doesn't have huge torque, that often means they're relying a lot on brute arm strength. And that's more of a concern for me on an injury scale. So, but the other similarity with Castillo and Buehler is they also have a lot of spine tilt. And that's one problem I've always had with Castillo. His actually starts early. Even during the stride, he'll start veering his head, veering off towards the glove side. And it's not that it's more pronounced this year, but it definitely hasn't gotten better. And that's something when I see it from a young player, it's not it doesn't seal the deal for me as far as it being a harbinger of doom or something, but it is something that I want to see a player get better with. Guys like Clayton Kershaw and Felix Hernandez, they came up with horrible spine tilt and slowly got better year by year. Now, fast forward to today, and they're both just a little bit above average. Not amazing, but where they've come from, they've increased and gotten better each season. So the fact that Castillo hasn't gotten better this season is a little bit of a bummer. But overall, I think he exploded onto the scene last year and surprised a lot of people. And those folks really invested a lot on draft day this year, and they're the ones that were probably disappointed at this point. He still absolutely has it in him, but yeah, when your whole game is predicated on velocity and fastballs and changeups, and you lose a tick and a half of velocity, and you don't have an increase in command to counterbalance, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and that's why I just can't quit him. I see starts like tonight and other starts where he looks like he still has it. What would you do if you owned Luis Castillo?
If I owned him, I wouldn't be partying with him, and I would target him overall. Although, you know what's tough about that is that I don't expect his velocity to rebound this season. And so basically, let's say he was worth, let's call it $1 on draft day. Obviously, he was worth a lot more than $1. But just for the sake of argument, let's say he was worth $1 on draft day. In my mind now, he's probably worth, in actuality, about 75, 80 cents. If you can find an owner who thinks he's worth 50 cents, then yeah, make that deal and extract the extra value. You know what I mean?
Okay. I gotcha.
But at the same time, if you're a current owner and he's been disappointing, I don't think he's suddenly going to get back to what he did last year. Not unless he has an improvement in skills, which I wouldn't expect at this juncture. We're halfway through the season now. So I would expect more of the 80% of what you invested in him on draft day, because he was also pretty well hyped, so you probably didn't get a discount.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Clayton Kershaw when you were talking about Luis Castillo and some others there. The back problems. He's a big dude. Is this something, as a guy that's had back problems, they don't go away. Once you have them, you have them. How is he going to deal with this? He's got so many moving parts with his delivery. It seems like maybe they're correct moving parts, and I don't know that, but there seems like a lot of moving parts in his delivery. Is this going to be something he can fix, or is this going to be really, really bad for the next few years?
He has an interesting delivery. He's really one of a kind. He's a unicorn, and his delivery is awesome because he learned how to repeat it. When he first came up, he couldn't repeat it at all, and that his crazy delivery in which he kind of has 3 speeds. He lifts his leg up, brings the leg back down, if it almost touches the ground, and then he has momentum forward, which you never see. He also has a bit of an up down, but the thing is, it's this really weird delivery, and it's funny when I look at the top 5 pitchers in baseball, 4 of them have a bunch of stuff in common, and the other one is always Kershaw. Like, whether it's a spine tilt thing, whether it's a momentum thing, whether it's a balance thing, he is always the exception to the rule. And I'm not willing to say that what he's doing is right or wrong. It's different than what I've come to appreciate. So I see it as something I need to learn from. However, it definitely puts extra strain on his back. The way that he delivers the baseball, it requires, especially on the low back, it puts a lot of strain on the low back. He has a lot of the up down, a lot of that herky jerky forward movement, and he does put a lot on his lower back. So it's the fact that that's one of his injuries is not surprising. It's kind of like, do you remember when he had hip issues a couple
Yeah.
years ago? And so he's someone where his method of torque has changed. He used to be a hips and shoulders fired almost together. And some guys teach this and some guys utilize this where the hips almost pull the shoulders through. And my problem with that is that's really hard on the hips. That's the kind of thing that would exacerbate a hip injury. And sure enough, he had hip issues. And that's something he has corrected over time. And now he doesn't do that anymore. I don't know that he would change his delivery to change the back thing. And like you said, that's not going away. Back issues flare up, they come back. And especially when his delivery puts extra stress on it. So it's definitely a concern of mine. It's a concern the rest of this year. It's a concern going forward unless he does something about it.
Yeah, I see people already talking about next year he's still a top 5 pitcher for him, and I'm not even worried about this year as much because I don't even know. He might only throw another – maybe he goes 30 innings, maybe he goes 70. We don't know. But, next year you'd assume he'd make it to the start of the season, and I want nothing to do with the guy. I didn't want anything to do with him this year. Is he kind of off your list already going into the next season?
It's –
well, assuming value, of course.
That's just it. Is my gut feeling is that others will value him a lot higher than I do. And I love Kershaw, even though he does things that are different than what I look for in pitchers. I'm a big Kershaw guy. I've got him in a couple of leagues. However, going into next year, as long as there are people who are not willing to see a huge discount, I'm not going to get him anywhere because someone else will take him. So and there's other guys that I would just rather have.
All right, last guy I want to ask you about, and we'll wrap this up, is Zach Wheeler of the New York Mets. Still only 28 years old, once a Giants top prospect, gets dealt in the Beltran deal, and he seems like he's slowly getting it together. He's not consistent by any means, but he puts together a handful of good starts, and he has a couple rocky starts in there. A really good one a couple of days ago against Pittsburgh, 7 innings, no earned, 7 Ks. It seems like he's figuring it out. His velocity looks great. What are you seeing with Zach Wheeler? Are you going to be a believer in him when it comes to fantasy, or is this kind of a roller coaster ride you want nothing to do with?
His velocity does look great. Command has always been a bit of an issue, even more so than control. And by control, I mean walk rate, and command, I mean actually hitting spots. And what I've seen so far is encouraging, but still not that encouraging. I feel like the prospect hype, unless it's been wiped completely clean and no one thinks about Carlos Beltran anymore when Wheeler's name is brought up.
Only Giants fans.
It's because to me, he's not that guy. Yeah, he's throwing that hard right now. He's throwing over 96 on average, but his secondaries he doesn't have command of, as near as I can tell. And so I'm just not really optimistic on him, although in general, I do like so many of the guys on the Mets staff. I love DeGrom. I am. I mean, I guess DeGrom's the easy case, the easy answer there. But I also like Steven Matz. I think Steven Matz is starting to come around. I think he is more interesting than Wheeler is right now, just because.
I was gonna ask. Do you think Matz is more of a legit thing right now?
Right now, I trust him more. To me, Wheeler, the Ks aren't enough to make up for the unpredictability with his ratios. Whereas with Matt, the Ks may not be where Wheeler's can be, but they're not going to be terrible. Meanwhile, I feel better about the ratios. And for me, that's a big thing in fantasy with pitchers is I try to preserve my ratios while getting as many strikeouts as possible. And there are certain guys that are strikeout heavy but are going to murder your ratios, and I tend to stay away from those. And I don't like having a roster full of Von Novas, but I do have a ton of rosters that have one Von Nova. Usually it's Von Nova.
No, that makes total sense. Doug, this was awesome. I could sit and talk to you for a long time about more and more players. It seems like every time we talk about one, I think about 3 other guys to talk about. So that was awesome stuff. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Brian. This is a ton of fun. And yeah, there's a bunch more pitching that I could talk about.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have you on again sometime. You keep making the rounds. You've been on a lot of good podcasts that I know the buddies on there, and that's awesome stuff. But most importantly, everybody, check him out on Baseballholics Anonymous. It is a great, great podcast for fantasy, for real life baseball, whatever you're into. If you like baseball, you're gonna love this podcast. They do a lot of fun ways of talking about it. I did want to salute you, and I will reach out to your co-host later. Your final segment this week on stats for scouting made me so happy because I have argued the BVP argument about people swear it's not a thing. I say, I'm not saying you have to believe stats for stats, but if you ever played the game of baseball, there is this thing called ownership. And that is what this shows you. And the way you guys described it was so much that's one thing you guys do great compared to a lot of people is you guys vocally say things the right way to explain it to people. Or I just turn into a curmudgeon and start arguing about it and tell people they're stupid. You actually spell it out. It makes so much more sense. I was so glad you guys made that argument there because I've been trying to preach that forever, and everyone just goes, "Oh no, you're a BVB guy," and that's just not true. So,
well, thanks a lot. That's awesome, and that's it. One thing that's really fun. I've known Sammy Reed for a long time, and that kind of thing comes through naturally in our discussions because. I just feel like we can have an honest talk about that. We can talk about our experiences and we can explain things in ways that basically we're used to having to explain it in a way the other person can understand, which happens to be conducive to hopefully people listening will understand. And yeah, that segment about how you really can't detach the numbers part of the game and the on-field part of the game. And yet each side kind of tries to do it a lot without appreciating the constant intersection. And it's amazing how often if there's not a stat for it or it's not a predictable stat based off the metrics we have, it's brushed away as something that doesn't exist. Like, look, you just don't know how to measure it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's plenty of examples of that, and they're everywhere. And the problem is when people start saying they don't exist, like if a stat head says that team chemistry doesn't exist because he doesn't know how to measure it and he doesn't know how to prove it or predict it, then a coach will instantly lose, or that stat head will lose all credibility with the coach because the coach knows, of course, it exists. And so that ends up becoming this big divide when really, can we just agree that the metrics for measuring chemistry suck?
pretty much. Yeah, no, and that's why I thought it was great because yes, there's a lot to be said about these stats, these new advanced stats, and they definitely need to be considered in the equation. But there's a whole other piece of the pie that you can't just ignore because the stat says one thing, and that's what I thought was great. Because that's the argument I always have with people that there's so much more than what just happens on a computer or something like that. Which I'm not saying doesn't have its purpose, but you can't exclude everything else. So
yeah, and on the flip side, you've got managers and coaches who are doing these stupid things like stuffing players into 100-pitch buckets and 30-pitch buckets. Like, it's like, well, it's not like the guys in the field are total geniuses that see everything. No, they miss a lot of the real obvious crap. And the thing is, they miss the obvious crap that the stat heads see very clearly and very easily. But then the stat heads often miss some of the obvious crap that players and coaches see easily. I mean, I'll just give one quick example of this. One of my jobs with the National Pitching Association, I saw all the little gadgets that came through, and everyone was trying to show us the next great thing for evaluating players. And I saw these ingenious contraptions and inventions, and some of them would be so scientifically sound. The problem is they would make a fundamental basic mistake that anyone who has ever played the game would never make. Almost always, by the way, this was a release point. Everybody or all these guys would use 60 feet 6 inches to measure release point to home plate, and
that's not where the ball's
pitcher has
released.
ever done that. Yeah, ever.
It says it's slow pitch softball.
And you would, if you want to see a university physicist jaw drop, yeah, you just tell them that.
Oh man, tell Randy Johnson 60 feet 6 inches.
Yeah.
He's probably like 40 feet 6 inches. Oh, that's great. That's outstanding. But Doug, again, awesome stuff. Everybody check out Baseballholics Anonymous. Doug is on Twitter at Doug_Thorburn. And man, this was honestly one of the funner ones I've done in a long time. Just talking, not even really stats or anything, just talking baseball. So that was a ton of fun, man. I appreciate it.
Well, same thing over here, man. I've had a ton of fun. Thanks so much for having me on.
Will do. Everybody, this is Bench with Bubba, episode 105 with Doug Thorburn. We'll catch you guys later.